Are we making a break or just I'm starting right now? I mean, I'm fine with both. Just all right, cool. So yeah, hi everyone. In case we don't know each other, my name is Ilija. In the last session, I assume for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about frame and characterization. So before I start with the content, just few kind of points of housekeeping / disclaimers. So firstly, in terms of the structure, this is going to be organized so that mostly is going to be relatively a little bit of theoretical approach, which I don't think really is a theoretical approach. I think it's just general some tips and some general remarks that I noticed that I use when I use characterization and frame, and also like maybe to define these things, to explain what do we mean by them, etc. And the bigger part of the session would be focused towards the examples, where together hopefully we're going to think of some good characterizations or frames about some certain topics, like motions that were set. So all the examples that were chosen are some examples from real life and some things that at least in some debates worked. So it is not nothing that has not been at least once tested. Other than that, I personally am not that big fan of PowerPoints, specifically for these kinds of sessions where we have lots of interactions, where we are kind of not maybe covering some content-heavy lectures, but rather something that is more oriented towards a practical approach, etc. So therefore, I did not create a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to copy the motions that we're going to how do you say, practice in the chat. So like hopefully it's going to be clear for everyone. I feel it's just easier both for me to deliver these kind of lectures, because then I'm not kind of forced to focus on the things on the slide, but rather can choose to take different amounts of time or focuses on these different aspects depending on the kind of group dynamics, etc. But also I feel that just also it is kind of a bit more engaging for participants. Yeah. Lastly, if there are any questions or anything that is unclear or you want me to repeat or something like that, I think you can just write it in the chat. I'll respond to everything, like maybe not everything straight away, but generally we'll address all the things that are said in the chat. Cool. So yeah, if there are no questions and assuming I'm audible, because I guess otherwise someone would interrupt me, we can start. So in terms of the characterization and frame, what do I mean by it? Usually when you're talking about it in terms of the characterization, we think of what is some description of reality or some aspects of reality that fits our side in defending this motion. In terms of the frame, I'm not really sure that there is some very clear distinction. I think that most of the characterizations are usually part of the frame. I think that probably the better, how to say, differentiation would be that the frame is maybe one specific type of characterization or one specific type of set of characterizations that you use for your side in order to argue, etc. In terms of this characterization of reality, what we often mean by it is some defensible description of reality that suits our side. So in terms of defensible description of reality, by defensible, I mean that is something that is that can be argued, that we can prove, or maybe we can be challenged upon it, maybe not, but generally something that is not like completely out of touch of reality, very difficult, etc. And of course, that it suits our side. I think it's relatively self-explanatory that we want to create this version of reality that is going to create arguments for our side stronger, while the arguments for the other side less strong, right? So I think this is a kind of a way how we think about these things. And I think often what is the case that I think that characterization is sadly not as much used, I think, as much as there is potential towards it. I feel that there are lots of good reasons why teams should try to characterize how the motion or how certain aspects of it work, etc. So let's use some working example that we can actually see what I mean, so I'm not maybe too abstract or something like that. So let's use the motion that was at worlds. Let me just copy this. So the motion is this house opposes the stigma against laziness. So this house opposes the stigma against laziness. So let's use this motion. So what do I mean by characterization? What are some things that can be characterized here? So I think first thing that probably we can think of is like, what is laziness, right? That might be the first step in terms of characterization. So like, what is the laziness? And probably everyone, this is something that's not maybe as controversial. Probably everyone has some kind of opinion what really laziness is like, you know, not going towards some very strict and productive roles in life, usually defined through some, let's say, either work-oriented or career-oriented or just even education-oriented, how do we say, things. But probably the second point, something that is more, I think, interesting to characterize, is how stigma against laziness specifically looks like, right? Because the motion is not, this house believes that laziness is good or bad, right? This is a different motion. The motion is this house opposes the stigma against laziness. So I think the second thing that can be characterized in this motion is like, how does the stigma against laziness look like in terms of what kind of these narratives or opinions, or like where it does it come from? Like whether it is, you know, like general narratives like, I don't know, American Dream, or just generally like from your environment, from parents, from things like that, whether it is that people just internalize that they are just, you know, not worthy, that they need to change something if they perceive that they are lazy and things like that, etc., etc. So in terms of like, so when we talk about the characterization, we think of how we're going to present some sort of reality for this specific motion that's going to create a stronger case for us. And let's say that we are up on this motion, so we are opposing of stigma against laziness, or we think that we are for the stigma against laziness. So what are some things that we can say about it? So again, one thing we said, we can characterize maybe the laziness and how laziness looks like, etc. Secondly, we can characterize why stigma around laziness looks like, etc. But then the question becomes in terms of, okay, what is the best strategy? What is some best thing that we can characterize around these things that we can maybe create some strong arguments around it? So, and I think that maybe you can think of, okay, what is the world? And I think this is one of the questions that are just universal that often you can ask yourself, like, what does the world look like right now, right? In terms of some general things and how this motion plays this within. And then you can think of, in terms of how people, what is the environment of people right now and how that can actually create your better arguments in these instances for opposition against, for like opposing the stigma against laziness. And I think one thing that you can think of, some characteristic of the world right now might be that, look, to a very large extent, a lots of people are, let's say, surrounded by things that just kind of are pushing you to be lazy, to be lethargic, to not move yourself, etc. One thing is that we generally have more sedentary lifestyles, like we work mostly from computers, we study from computers, we just don't move as much, and then just generally kind of being more kind of slow and not really engaging, etc. The second thing is that the generally just environment around us is kind of making us addicted on a short-term dopamine rushes. So like, e.g., social media. So like almost any social media now operates around some notion of either reels or like TikTok or like short videos that just kind of are giving you some kind of short-term reward that you are just hooked up and you just want to get it again and again. Meaning it's like, and we are surrounded by it everywhere, right? You have your phone when you, I don't know, when you commute, at classes, at, I don't know, family dinner, like literally everywhere, right? So you are constantly in the instances when you can just get literally endless scroll of things that are just going to give you some kind of rewards, and if you're not getting them, that you are actually becoming hooked and want to look for it, etc. So that can be a second thing. I think thirdly, you can characterize that generally just people are, it's easier to be lazy, right? This is something that kind of not being lazy requires quite a lot of effort to put in, right? And that, how do you say, for these reasons, and usually this effort needs to be put in the long term, without a proper reward being received at the end. So if I want to get a good job or something like that, I need to learn certain skill or to finish a faculty, I need to work for a long time to pass exams, to study, to have sleepless nights, to I don't know, to go over all failures, etc. And in this process that is more difficult, requires lots of action, etc., I don't necessarily receive instant rewards, while laziness usually gets us some instant and short-term rewards that are much more like certain, etc. So probably you can characterize how people in this specific world think about laziness, and why laziness is easier for them, etc. Now the question becomes, once when we characterize as the society and specifically relations of laziness and society, or the people that generally lives in another world, we can think of, okay, how does this helps us to make a good argument on op? And I think then you can have this good strategy, which is like not really some complicated strategy, but it's literally just, laziness is much easier for individuals, and without a very strong stigma, it is more likely that you just fall into this laziness loop and then don't work towards the self-improvement, right? And I think that then you are able to explain why not only laziness is sometimes good, sometimes bad, but why specifically stigma against laziness is necessary for you to get out of this kind of lethargic state, etc. But moreover, you can still characterize why laziness itself is so harmful for individuals. It is not that you really just chill and don't do anything, but rather you just are being obsessed with your thoughts, with with the future, that that you all need to get some job done, and like some maybe to become employed or something like that. And generally that usually if you have that much time and just that you feel just lethargic, you don't have much energy, that you are not really passionate about doing anything because you can do everything all the time. Like if you have so much time, like you don't feel like watching movies and things like that, and then just it creates kind of this depression and a lack of energy, then it further perpetuates, because it's just more difficult for you to work towards the long-term goals and to put this much effort, which then just makes things like laziness kind of more likely, which just creates this cycle, etc., etc. So now, why is this characterization like about laziness and about how society interacts with individuals regarding laziness is important if you are maybe on the op in this specific motion? Because then you're able to have this case that, look, this is why stigma against laziness is necessary for people to lead a more meaningful life where they're actually happy and more fulfilled and things like that. Okay, are there any questions or any comments on this specific motion? Yeah, if yes, at any point, we can address them. The thing is that how do you say that often when you receive emotions like this, you often teams, specifically teams in the top half, would just think of straight some ideas that you can think of, like 4 against laziness, or like 4 against stigma around laziness, etc. But you don't think specifically how this laziness looks like in real life, and specifically how now, and why specifically stigma against or laziness is stigma of laziness is necessary. Then I think that often there's some very important burdens that are left out that you can then further fulfill. And there are then few things that can be useful around this. I think one useful thing is that this characterization of world that suits your case is just building some stronger premises for your case, right? Because if you describe the world as it is, then all of the arguments that you can run in terms of impacts and stuff like that can be sort of predicated upon this characterization of what the world looks like right now, meaning that this characterization, it is some inherent characterization of how the world looks like, with some strong inherent, or like how it's called now, structural reasons or whatever. This means that this is just much stronger stronger premise for your case. I think this is one thing. I think the second thing is just it creates a more strong possible response towards towards the other side, right? Because then often these characterization frames in itself can respond to many different the different claims that might receive that you might get from the other side. I think thirdly, it can be useful because it can provide an extension, often in a case when basic ideas, etc., are done by your opening. I think often these kind of characterization frames can just add some new premises and burdens in the debate when you explain them, that just makes the case that in front of you stronger, and then usually can be a good extension. I think lastly, or like 2 more things actually. Lastly, there is it creates more realistic arguments, and just gives you this kind of reality check sort of that just allows you to filter out some bad or less relevant arguments, etc. And really, the lastly is, I think it's a very useful thing for ESL speakers. It's useful for everyone, but I think specifically for ESL or EFL speakers even, I think it is just a way to deal with someone that can actually produce much more content in the same amount of time, because English is their native language. So I think for these reasons, this is something that is just very important thing to consider in the round. So let's go over some questions received in chat, and then we'll proceed with some more examples. So from Piotr, we have, what do you think is more useful? Starting for what do we want to prove towards the characterization, or from thinking about how the world looks like, you think of arguments? So I think it's better to think of how the world looks like, and then how we can use it for our arguments. I think this is, in my opinion, so maybe other things might work for different people. I don't think that debating has a correct answers necessarily, but in my opinion, I think it's better to think about this, because I think a few reasons why I think it's better. I think one is somehow it is just natural to think of, okay, how does this phenomenon look like? And then, okay, how can you use it for our advance? I think it's just, in my opinion, for me, it's more intuitive way of thinking. The second reason I think it's a better approach is because I think just it is easier to not forget some of the attacks or some uncomfortable. It's not easy to tunnel vision and don't think about something that might be strong responses on the other side. So in my opinion, I think it's better to start from this, to try to characterize it more generally, and then think of towards your case. Obviously, this is a skill that needs to be practiced. So like maybe if you haven't done or even think about it like at all. Maybe it's not, maybe do it on some spars or like some comps before Euros, etc. Don't just do it on the round one Euros and then just to experiment there. So obviously I would say maybe to experiment a little bit before it and then to see what works for you. But this is the way how I do it. Okay, then there is okay, let me just I'm a bit boomer for Zoom, but yeah, I'll probably figure out. So second question, ideally, if most of the characterization legwork is already done by opening, as closing, what can we bring in terms of characterization? This distinguishes us, or do we run with the, sorry. Or do we run with the characterization already settled in debate? Okay, so I think the question from Siddharth, so like if the opening already did quite a lot of characterization, I think it depends really, because sometimes if you think that there are some aspects of characterization that are missing, that you can still use it as a part of your extension. If you think that really they characterize everything about the status quo and about the things that works for you and about some inherent features, etc., probably you can extend on some other ways. Maybe they didn't impact it very well, etc. I think realistically, it often is the case that not everything is done, and this is often something that things are left out. So for example, in the case about the laziness, there are a few things that you need to characterize. One is why laziness is easier for people, like the example that we discussed, why laziness is more intuitive and easier for people. Secondly, why stigma is necessary. Thirdly, why it creates this perpetual cycle of, how do you say, the depression that is more laziness, more depression, etc., etc. So there are a few kind of burdens here. It is a rarely situation that opening does all of these things. If they do, often it's very difficult to necessarily beat them. Probably going for second, something like that, it might be a good strategy. But I think often it happens that some of these things are not as characterized very well. And then you as a closing can say, okay, these things are missing, and here why it is so important thing. So for example, if in this example, let's say this, like in this example that we worked on, that opening didn't explain this cycle of, how do you say, that laziness creates more lethargy and depression, which creates more laziness, etc., etc. Then you can explain, look, this characterization is important because it kind of just explains why it is just a long-term problem and how it is perpetuated and why it is necessarily to cut it at the beginning and therefore why this is necessary. So this might be some form of weighing. But yeah, hopefully this, but generally, like, just it depends, like whether we run on their characterization or want to characterize something differently. I think it really depends from case to case basis. So yeah, then we have third question, which is in general, what is the strategy to deal with the competing frames? For example, if a government comes in and says that the world is too obsessed with productivity, corporate culture is rampant and causes burnout. Okay, so also, if you top half already do some framing, how do you justify your characterization compared to your first half without stopping them? Okay, this is the second. So yeah, we'll firstly address the competing frames characterization. So I think that the general things that work for rebuttal works also for the competing characterization of rebuttals. So think of like, how would you respond to any other arguments? I think one thing might be just, okay, here are some reasons why their frame is like not true. Like either you analyze some incentives of some individuals or something like that, or their ability or their capability or things like that. In terms of this specific example, like if Prop says we're obsessed with the productivity culture and we are all just grinding and things like that, and this is the characterization, and then the op is just much more easy for individuals to, how do you say, become, you know, lazy, and we need like a strong stigma against it, etc. I would say a few things. I think one, I would say that this characterization of productivity and obsession is probably the product of stigma against laziness, and that then how do you say that we cannot take it for granted, right? So the question is whether this is better or this constant struggle and depression and lack of working, etc. At which point I think then kind of you need to compare which is worse, like whether the anxiety because you work too much and you're obsessed with productivity, or the fact that you are just depressed because you feel that you're not working towards any meaningful your goals, and you get into, how do you say, abyss and things like that. Again, I feel that there are few like inherent reasons why you can claim that one is true more than the other, and I think that then just analytically in terms of how you would respond to any other argument becomes the how do you say becomes the way to resolve this competing decharacterization. So I think there is no inherent difference between characterization and argument, right? It's just everything is kind of intertwined, right? It's all part of the one another and things like that. So I think that it's really like the same way as you would respond to an argument, you can respond to the competing characterization. So then the next question is like, also, if your top half already did some framing, how do you justify your characterization compared to your first half without stabbing them? So again, I would say it depends from the specific case by case basis, but few things that you can do. I think one, you can argue which frame is more likely, or which characterization is more likely. So the question is, again, whether they are necessarily kind of opposing characterizations, in which case probably it is like stab, right? Or it is just they are missing some part of characterizing some important stakeholders or the aspects of world or things like that. There are some general things that I can think of in terms of characterization that can help you advance in terms of advance the characterization if in case that opening already did some quite good legwork. I think one is that so one is like, if there are some things missing, explain why these are very important burden, why without them the scope of their arguments, etc., is missing or not as relevant, etc. I think second is this kind of perpetuating in terms of why there is one small differences in terms of, how do you say, you are being tilted towards one or the other side. It means that you are more likely just going to get to the extreme of that side. So this is something that often can be done. So again, on the same example of laziness, the fact that once you become lazy, it's more difficult to work towards a longer goal, and then just means that you become more like depressed and then becomes more lazy as a consequence of this, etc. Important with this analysis is because it explains that, if you start going towards laziness, it becomes more and more extreme and more difficult to get out of it, meaning that the impacts of it becomes larger. So I think this might be one way to extend this characterization. But I think there is a meta question here, like whether there is some way to characterize how it moves towards more of the extreme. Obviously, just take care that you don't go into like slippery slope kind of argumentation, but like I think it can be done with this regard. I think third thing that can be done is to think of why right now is there something that you can characterize, how do you say, this motion here. I think, again, on the laziness example, the why now can be kind of, social media and lots of these things that are just bombarding us out all the time and meaning us that we just, endlessly scrolling and not doing anything kind of productive, things like that. So these kind of questions can sort of helps you advance characterization and then explain why these advances compare. So, but if you're running completely opposite one in terms of like going, oh, but this is completely not true, completely if it's really a stab, then there is a problem. And I think that at this moment, probably you should choose a different strategy or something like that. But I think often the way how characterization extension works is that you just kind of feel the missing burdens here. The second thing that you can do, like instead of missing the feeling burdens, and these questions you can ask yourself, is to think of whether there is some way to minimize the importance of frame of your side in front of you. I'm going to talk about it a bit further, but I'm going to address the last question that was here. So in the more technical debates, e.g. finance, currency, etc., how do you add new framing characterization as MGMO without being accused of naively contradicting your opening, especially when opening just give decent, well-detailed truths about that area? About the technical debate. So I think that just I feel that the same responses that just went for the previous question work here as well. I'm not sure what more technical the debates make a difference. Presumably the difference is that maybe there are some, hardwired truths, but I feel that's not necessarily the case because again, what is the truth? The truth is something that people in debate both sides agreed upon, right? Especially some technical like currencies, finance, etc. I feel that just more easy to spin certain truths and things like that. So like whether inflation is good or bad, it depends to an extent, right? There is no hardwired truth about it. Like whether it's going to something lead to hyperinflation, again, depends, right? From how it works. Whether AI is going to destroy the world or create some utopia, again, depends. So I feel that just if debates are more technical, I don't think that a priori there is anything that just kind of limits the scope. If debate is really shallow, I think like often what you can do is just go for a second, just respond to the other side, etc. I'm not saying that you can always have an extension to any team in any round. This is just something that I feel is, how do you say, not possible, especially in the format that we have. Cool. I think that I addressed all the questions that came here so far. I would like to go to the second example, if everyone is fine with it, or if not, you can write in chat and I can address that at some point. So yeah, so let me just see. Okay, so the second motion that I want to discuss about is, let's say that we are prop on the motion, this house would introduce brothels in military bases. So yeah, this was an actual motion was said quite some time ago. Yeah, but I think that, yeah. So what are some good ideas for strategy in terms of, like, let's say if you are prop that we on the government. So what do we envision that are things that need to be characterized here? Does anyone want to like start with this?
I think an important characterization here would be what life is at like military bases and the human tendencies that people face in and of itself, is like going through that kind of military rigor, etc., etc.
All right. Yeah, definitely something that do what people do in the absence of brothels, probably correct, but maybe more specific, like what do they do? Like in terms of Piotr, what do you mean by it? Like what? Or okay. Yeah, the action outside of military bases. Cool. What else? Does anyone have any other ideas? So yeah, they might masturbate. That's also fair, I guess. Maybe why military is sometimes done as conscription. So first, okay, but how would you explain why conscription, i.e. the military, some soldiers are forced there? How would you place it this motion? Like, because this is definitely, for example, the conscription, etc., is definitely an aspect, specifically of some kind of conflicts and wars. But the question is like whether this characterization was going to help us kind of build our case. I personally don't see how it could, but yeah, but yeah, let's then circle back to these two things that were said. So like in terms of what they're doing outside of their military bases, and in terms of like the people's needs, etc. Also what these brothels will look like heavy regulations to safeguard the interests of sex workers. So I think that yeah, and which can regulate the acts within the bordellos, etc. So yeah, I think we can sort of take all of these stuff and maybe try to create one proper strategy here. So what are some things that we already said? Like, firstly, why kind of sexual intercourse is important for people and why they were likely going to seek some kind of satisfaction regardless. Secondly, is like whether there is a way to get us outside of the military bases. Thirdly, whether these military bases are regulated or not, right? And then and in which way, how does it look like, etc. There is some higher safety regulations. And I think that then this is a good, if we combine all these things, I think then the good question becomes, okay, whether this is necessarily of existing of Rodels or not, whether the debate is about this, or whether there is about specific things that state is doing here. Because I think what often will happen here is that you'll have, for example, proposition running, why it is good to have Rodels in military bases, or that why it is good that soldiers that go to war have kind of like sexual intercourse, right? In op, you'll probably get some reasons why generally like brothels are a bad idea, why there is why prostitution is bad in general, etc. There's some strategy around this. I think there are very clear claims that everyone can think of. But then the question becomes in terms of, okay, whether we can characterize the world somehow that it can change the comparative. I think the way how we can do it for prop is to say, look, there, and I think there is kind of hinting towards it from multiple responses in the chat, which is, look, probably some kind of prostitutions around military bases happen anyway. The question is whether it is better to be done by a state that is intervening or to be done by unregulated warlords and people around you. And then if we think about this as a strategy, then I think it's relatively straightforward in terms of what we need to prove, like what our burdens are. I think one is might be like why there are some huge incentives, but also ability of, you know, these conflicts providing these like military bases. In terms of incentives, like, okay, like lots of these like are just, you know, young men, and just generally like, you know, conflicts are stressful, and there is like, you know, but also there is like, I don't know, macho culture, how do you say, certain narrative, both like biological but also societal kind of pushes for people to have sex, specifically in the instance when people go to war, they don't know when they're going to return. It's a very stressful situation. They're away from home, and you know, things like that, where they're already young, sometimes might be constricted and things like that. And then just there is lots of lots of, how do you say, lots of incentives of other actors around here. Like you have a very weak institutions in these kind of, how do you say, in the countries when you have interventions or where you have military bases, you often have certain warlords, you have instability, you don't have like a really good protection of human rights, etc. So there are some kind of incentives to provide or to cater to this demand, right? So meaning that the question is whether, you know, soldiers will meet prostitutes, probably not that much comparative. What is comparative is whether these brothels will be done by a state, in which case there is a more likelihood, a more incentives, and more ability to regulate them and to create some, you know, how do you say, something when there are some, I don't know, less STDs, less violence against these women, some certain rights, probably some higher wages, etc., like more choice, etc., though might not be the perfect, still it is probably preferable to the alternative when the warlords run these bases, these brothels, and when, you know, soldiers have just, you know, more ability to be violent, when you have more unprotected sex, more human traffickings and things like that, etc., etc. Again, like let's try to abstract and see how did we reach this frame. Again, this is one of the frames that just like all of these frames and characterizations were used in some of the examples in some of the rounds. So like we try to see what are some characterizations of aspects of this warfare, like of how soldiers look like, what their incentives are, who are these people, what are these places where, you know, that, you know, military bases generally occur, and etc. How these states look like, etc., and how these brothels would look like, right? And then we can, when we characterize all of these things, then we can think of, okay, what is the way how we can change the comparative with our frame? Because frame is nothing just, you know, change of the comparative that suits your side, right? Just you're selling your version of reality that works for your side. Here, if you're prop, you want to have kind of version of reality that just says, look, brothels are probably not that comparative. What is comparative is whether to which extent they are regulated and whether they're done by a state that actually has some good incentives and want to create certain standards rather than some less, how do you say, more rogue actors and things like that. All right, are there any questions for this? So, yeah, why would warlords have brothels and why is not about brothels within the city? So, yeah, it can be within the city, but you can say that they still have kind of a lack of regulations that you're talking about. In terms of that, often when there are military bases, yeah, I think it's more like framing an explanation, that it's not only brothels. I think it's generally just you can say that once you have military bases that are abroad, that often you have countries that are sadly like less developed. They have less weaker institutions and like worse protection for prostitutes, and it's generally just more difficult to enforce all these kind of laws, meaning that often who profits in these cases are people like warlords, people like corrupt politicians, or like corrupt businessmen, etc. So like I don't think necessarily you need to prove that warlords specifically, but I just think that actors that are likely going to create these kinds of brothels in these kind of conflict or like unstable areas are just generally like people that are just don't have as good actors as state. So I think this is the way that just the explanation of this just means that like sort of who wins the clash of characterizations. I can paste another example like where similar logic sort of applies. Let me just it's kind of similar to the first, but yeah, this house regrets the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue. And then we can do probably a similar thing here, right? We can say, look, what often would happen is that there will be a chat whether forgiveness is a virtue or whether it's a good or bad, right? Like it's good if people forgive, they feel better about themselves, stuff like that, right? Or like, oh, it is bad that you force people to forgive. Sometimes there are certain problems that happen why you don't want to forgive, or like it's bad to be forced, etc. But I think that again a good frame here, let's say from the prop, but probably something similar can be done on the op, might be to say, look, often forgiveness will happen in terms of the number or quantity of forgiveness is likely going to be relatively symmetric in terms of after some time, people just generally don't become as salty, etc. And in many of these instances that are not as severe, they're likely to just, they lose part of their like passions and these emotions, and they don't feel as much hurt, etc. So they are probably going to just forgive them anyway. And like there are some instances that are very, very severe that probably you never forgive like anyway. But the question is whether this specific narrative is a good thing. And then you on the prop can say, look, what is problematic is that, how do you say, that this narrative forces people to forgive sooner, which means that one, you have a less genuine forgiveness, meaning that you're just forced to forgive, that you would likely forgive in like 5 months or like 2 years or whatever, but then presumably you would actually feel that you actually make this forgiveness and that you just feel that you actually can make a peace, meaning that you then you'll not just suppress this anger and this dissatisfaction, which will then accumulate and be just worse in the future. That can be one comparative. Or secondly, that this other individual will have more time to reflect and actually to seek forgiveness, to show that actually they feel sorry, etc. We just take some time, etc., meaning that actually this forgiveness will be more genuine. You're going to have a better relation and things like that. So I think again, similar logic can apply. Like this is happening anyway. Again, a frame that can work in many instances, and I think you can always ask yourself, like, what is the comparative? Like, is it really the comparative the first thing that comes up to our mind? So in the case of the brothels in the military bases, is it really comparative, like whether it is good the soldiers are going to brothels? Or the comparative is who creates these kind of brothels, right? if you create this, it can change the comparative. It can make it worse for some other teams. It can just become more tricky for other teams to respond to your case, etc. Similar to here, like, is it really a narrative whether we are for or against forgiveness, or for or against forgiveness is a virtue, or we believe that like forgiveness relatively happens to a similar extent, but the question is whether this narrative specifically forces people to forgive sooner, once when they're not ready, or once when they're not legitimate forgiveness, meaning that there will be some harms associated towards this. All right. So yeah, these are some examples. Hopefully, the logic behind this is clear. Again, something that how do you say there is no clear recipe how you can do it in every single situation, in every single case, right? But I think that thinking in this direction can actually help you in, how do you say, thinking of these kind of frames in certain situations, which again completely change the comparative. And so, for example, to link this to some questions regarding how do you compare yourselves towards your opening without being knifed, or things like that, etc. So let's say that we are talking about the, I don't know, brothels in military bases round. Then you can say, if you're siege, you can say, look, opening argument explained by brothels in military bases will be good. Opening position explaining why brothels in military bases will be bad. We tell you that probably we agree with opening argument, they will be good, but we believe that the importance of this argument is less relevant because brothels happen on any way on a similar levels of extent. The question that is more comparative is what kind of brothels we get, and which is like whether they are more likely going to be run by state and regulated or by other actors and not regulated. Therefore, this is the bigger comparative, and this is something that we win with, right? In which instance we don't have a knifing, right? We don't have a contradictory case. We agree with them. We agree that this is correct. But even if op is completely agree, even if they are true, like no matter, regardless of this clash, our case has a much stronger arguments that are more comparative and more relevant, right? Similar to this, regards that the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue. If you're CG, OG explains why forgiveness can often be a bad stuff, and it is bad if people are forced to, how to say, forgive. Opposition explained to you why forgiveness is often a good stuff and why we need to kind of push people to forgive, etc. We tell you that forgiveness likely going to happen on both sides of the house. The question is whether we have a genuine quality forgiveness or negative forgiveness, in which case the importance of these, how do you say, arguments about the forgiveness is a good or bad thing just is reliant upon these time differences that we actually explain rather than some abstract differences, etc. If you really want to be sure that you're like kind of not, how do you say, contradictory or like intentional, etc., you can say, look, you can just point out that the premise of the thing in front of you is that there is a huge differences in terms of number of forgiveness we are getting that they don't address, and how do you actually address these things, etc. Personally, I feel that like it's not often the case that these things are characterized as nice. If it is done in instances like this, I feel that often they pass with judges, and I think it's legitimate kind of case. All right, are there any questions for these two specific examples? All right. Okay, we can then do one more example. So the motion is, this house would significantly increase government funding for research into the effect of genetics on human characteristics, development, and behavior. So I don't know, do you have some things that you think should be characterized here, and how would you characterize them? And
can I try? So I think like it's very useful to talk about like why genetic like research is like important, but I think it's also important to characterize like why governments have like capacity to do this well in terms of like the funding.
right. Okay. So like why this research is important, why governments will do it well. What else can you characterize? Okay, excellent. So like you can characterize whether there are other actors. I see in the chat similar. So I will frame whether there is a lot of funding already and not why you need more. Okay, yeah, sure. Like this is one thing that can be characterized. What else do we receive? How much you can prove the link between genetics and behavior, e.g. scientific capacity. I think, again, important stuff, like, right, how much we can actually prove these stuff, whether they are difficult, etc. I think there is one more thing that is probably more straightforward, but I feel that I'm not sure we already got it. So who would use the research? Yeah, okay, but I'm not. So government can fund research in local region genetics that could otherwise be overlooked or non-profitable. Okay, yeah, these are, or how people would perceive the research. Okay, all these things I think are legit. But I think that just a more general, maybe more straightforward question is like, what kind of research can be proven, right? Or yeah, or like what kind of behavior it is more likely to go to, like because I think it's a very important question to ask, like what we are talking about right here in terms of like all of these things are relevant, like state versus a private or other actors, like okay, like who puts money there, like whether there is already enough money or whether state needs to put more money because they are the only ones who actually deal with some, I don't know, rare or like region specific stuff or things like that. How people will perceive it. All of these things are relevant, but I think that the first thing that probably is like the premise of all the premises is kind of what kind of this research is likely going to be done and what is likely going to be proven. I would say that these are two probably specific things, specifically in these kind of motions like this, because again, let's say that you are prop here, like we already heard some things from Alp. I think, like as I said, all these things are good things to characterize and to prove. But let's say you're a prop here. I think there is a relatively obvious upline that, or like obvious clash, I would say, about things like some bigger impacts, like racism, sexism, you like you name it. So like whether there is a link, like the prop can easily run here that we're going to be able to prove that, I don't know, people of all races, let's say, are equally smart in math, or that women and men are equally smart in math, or like whatever. Like you can prove a prop can try to prove this. Op can try in terms of, oh, but people will perceive it that is not the case. There will be different research that some of them might be competing, or some of them might be flawed, or like small samples. And then like right wing will focus on these kind of research and then just frame everything about them and think that they actually have an evidence, etc. You can probably expect these kind of claims to be run, probably sensible claims in terms of like that you can run on both sides of the house. But then the question becomes is it really going to be about these kind of cases? And I think often if you think of like who would actually fund research that wants to link these kind of, how do you say, things like, let's say, race and certain abilities to, I don't know, learn languages or do math or like whatever. It's probably going to be very good reasons not to do it. You can claim that there might be, I don't know, bias towards the left wing in academia in general, but just generally like a backlash, fear, both from like private entities, but also from states, from certain groups, etc. No one's to put their reputation behind these programs. They're going to be perceived as racist, even if you prove like positive outcomes. It's going to be perceived that you're even thinking about these things, etc., etc. So these things are unlikely going to be even the question. And I think this kind of characterization, in terms of we're not going to deal with these kind of stuff, you can already kind of these two potential arguments that might happen on the prop and op, you can outframe them and say they don't matter as much because we're not doing these kind of things. So we can actually say, look, what we are likely to do and we can likely to prove is some more specific things in terms of capability I don't know, certain regions to have links towards certain, I don't know, mental health conditions, or certain genes towards certain mental health conditions, or certain these kind of very specific things that actually, one, there is some political capital actually to work and people are already working towards it. Secondly, they don't have necessarily these kinds of huge impacts and huge societal harms and huge problems that can be associated with them, etc. And then like often it can be kind of profited around, etc. And then I think even if you just characterize what is the research that is likely going to be taught here, and that people will actually work, and what is likely going to be proven, I think here already you are kind of creating a stronger claims on prop and kind of responding to some strong claims on op. So I think this kind of characterization, I would say, would be very important to have, or like very useful to have. But often it will be kind of thing that everyone will think in their head, okay, I know how this looks like, or I know where this applies, so I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to discuss that in prep. I'm not going to analyze that. And then everyone will run what they actually think. And sometimes people will agree, sometimes they will disagree, but then you will not be like, it will be helpful to think about this, right? This is the premise of all the premises, like what is this research and what is actually going to be proven. And then I think you can actually characterize the other stuff, right? Whether there is already sufficient amount of money, because in prop you can say, look, private sector is like very risky. It's not maybe as profitable. You cannot really capitalize on all of these stuff, etc. But also like often, state, when they put money, you cooperate with private sector, etc. So this is the way how you deal with this. And there are some specific stuff like region-specific characteristics, etc. That can be more relevant. And then on op, you can say, oh, this is just a waste of money already when there is a sense, private companies are doing for these specific incentives, etc., etc. And then you prove these things. And then, there is this clash of characterization. Again, I think realistically what happens often is that then this important question in terms of what is actually going to be developed and what research is going to be conducted is just not analyzed. And then you have kind of carte blanche to run this as a case or as extension, etc. And you can win simply by analyzing this and then impacting these kind of things. So just be aware of characterization of how this looks like. It's just, again, a real life example of the extension that worked. So just be aware of this. We got some questions. So like, can you run an argument on limited state resources, then counterprop on using that funding on another more important issue? So yeah, you can definitely run the limited state resources, right? The counterprop, I would say, is unnecessary complication in my opinion, because if you just explain that, state is wasting quite a lot of, you can just explain this is very expensive, right? Because you need to prove, like you need to conduct, so many studies, you need to, how do you say, prove these things. This is very, like, you need fancy equipment, you need all of these stuff. You need all of these like ethical committees, etc. And then like it's very difficult to prove, meaning if you're likely going to have a very vague conclusions, etc. I think this is also a fair kind of case to be run. But the counterprop, I would say that then you're required to say that these things will be spent on some more important issues. I would rather just say, look, we have so many different alternatives. No matter on what we spend, it is something that is going to have more tangible impact and more clear things. So like if we increase welfare, it is good because, some people get welfare. If we just reduce taxes, it is still better because people have more like disposable income. Even if we put it in defense, it is better because our country is going to be protected more than certain bellicose, aggressive countries that might attack us, etc. So like no matter what the what the alternative is, it is better because it is unlikely going to succeed and unlikely going to have certain, how do you say, positive impacts, while we have a certain harms of spending like usually quite a lot of money. And even if it is just, different kind of research, it is still better, etc. So like rather than counterprop, I would just say that, it is necessarily waste a lot of money and many different stuff you can do. So like there is likelihood that this money will be spent better. The second thing that I would like to say regarding this thing is that I feel that you can still get this from the characterization of what kind of research and how does this research look like. Because I think then there is a good kind of think of like how we can actually prove that, you know, people with this specific gene actually are more likely to have, I don't know, ADHD or like whatever the research can be. It's like a huge claim. You need so much research, so much luck, so many people that actually will participate, so many trials, these kind of machines that you don't want. So you can really explain what all of these things that you need to get done, and why often, you know, it is just a waste of both human resources but actual resources. But again, you can get them from characterization, thinking of like how this is going to look like, right? We were just dealing with the prop case. I think you can get to this case even in characterizing in the op case. We have one more question. In this house, does Gov not have the fiat to claim they have the resources? So yeah, you can definitely, you have a fiat to claim that you have a resources to do this policy, but it's you are still allowed to say on top, sure, but these resources are still in total like zero sum, and otherwise like you would be able to spend on some better stuff. So like let's say that this significant funding is, I don't know, like I'm just making numbers now, up like $10 billion dollars a year, right? You can claim, look, we have this amount of money as a state, but on both sides of the house, but we don't. But the question is how we use them. On the prop, you claim that you use them on this specific thing. On op, we can use them on myriad other stuff. We think it's better. So you can claim that you have resources, but there's a better way to spend these resources. If this makes sense. All right. Are there any more questions for this? The max that prove your characterization, I would say. So that is just more difficult for them to respond towards it. But also, secondly, I would just I think that one good thing about the characterization that you are thinking of how does this look like in real life, and then when you analyze this is more likely going to be some things that are more difficult to respond to, right? When you're talking now in terms of like what kind of research is likely or unlikely going to be done, I think just this is easier to prove rather than whether people will believe that, you know, they solve racism or that actually they confirm racism, right? Because then both things can happen on both, like kind of both sides. But if you just explain, okay, this is how this process looks like, I think often these are things that are more difficult to respond to. I think, yeah, this is you're absolutely correct that this opens a path for other teams to just respond to your characterization, and then like everything that relies on it kind of goes down. But a few observations towards this. I think if you have different kind of points, you know, that are not necessarily relying on characterization or something like that, if the other team is running a characterization that kind of has some overarching explanation that responds to all of these points, then you kind of are already more vulnerable towards this type of debating. I think this is one of the problems. I think secondly, often arguments have already their inner premises, right? Some things that upon which they are predicated upon. Now, the question just becomes whether these things are, whether you're aware of it and you prove it, or whether everyone in debate sort of kind of things like nothing is happening. So for example, even if you're running if you're not characterizing here, like what kind of research is being conducted, there is still kind of what arguments you make are still predicated upon which research is being conducted, right? If you're making an argument that you actually solve racism, but like say prove for many people that racism doesn't make sense, there is the underlying premise that the research that is going to be proven and funded is the research that is going to actually show that, you know, there is a equality among races in certain aspects, right? Or like similar to the sexism or something like that. Or if you want to show that, I don't know, you're going to solve some illness, etc., then again, there is a premise that there will be research that's going to specifically be funded to and able to solve these things, right? So there is always these kind of premises. Just the question is whether you actually prove these premises or you are able to see it as a team and say, okay, these are the ways how actually we are able to prove these premises, and that is why this is the analysis that is more important than the analysis of the team in front of us, because it's actually proving to a larger extent our case. So I would say that usually you already do it anyway. Just the question is whether actually you're aware of it or whether you're just assuming these kind of big premises. I don't know, maybe another example. Maybe this example from last year. So this house would, just to characterize this last question, this house would only provide state pensions to those mentally or physically unable to work. So let's say that you are up here and you want to say, okay, so like the prop explains, that, how do you say, that there are more and more old people, and people just live longer and longer and have fewer kids, and like the demographic pyramid, kind of thing that you have less people who contribute towards the GDP and more people who actually get the money from pensions and stuff like that. This kind of claim, and then you don't necessarily need to characterize how this process will look like in terms of how will state guess who actually is mentally or physically unable to work, right? You don't necessarily need to prove this. But if OP is able to say, okay, here are some reasons why this process of deciding who is mentally or physically unable to work, or for you as an individual to prove that you're mentally or physically unable to work, is going to be so difficult to prove, so humiliating, etc., meaning that even for these individuals, it's going to be difficult to get pensions. Even though that you might not characterize the counterclaim on the prop, the fact that you have this vulnerability still allows the opposition to attack you on this same vulnerability. Just if you analyze that, you just are more resilient towards this vulnerability. Let's say something like that. So I think that there is already this ability to attack these premises of your case. Just if you prove them, I think you have a higher chance, right? And yeah, I agree that maybe you might be able to say to other teams, okay, here is where we actually are. This is actually our premise. But often I feel that just teams don't exploit it that much, especially if you have some decent analysis. But also, the last thing that I'm going to say with regards to this, because I think it's a good question, right? I think the last thing is that even if they're able to defeat your characterization, if you're still able to prove it to some extent, it doesn't mean that necessarily you become fourth, right? Because it's very difficult to prove that something doesn't happen at all or things like that, right? Often there is it's much more easy to prove that's like some plausibility in some claim rather than no plausibility in that claim, right? So if you're able to prove, like, let's say 45% that your characterization is correct, and the other side is able to prove that 55%, that doesn't mean that you got fourth. Probably you got second, right? But if you just assume this characterization, you don't prove it at all, then I guess you have a more like leeway. You can become fourth and things like that. So yeah, hopefully this addresses this question. Okay, I think we are approaching the end of the session. So I would just like to check if there are any more questions, or we can wrap it up. Yeah. Okay. I think that's. I think then in. I think that there are no more questions. Anyway, if like you have any more questions or clarifications for some things that we talked today, feel free to message me or something. Thanks everyone who stayed for this session. Hopefully this was useful for you. Obviously, it's not possible to just give you some universal powers that you're going just to use characterization to win every single round, but hopefully some of these things will be very useful for you. So yeah, thanks everyone, and see you around.